Hello, and welcome to Sakana today's Last Week in AI podcast. We can hear us chat about what's going on with AI. As usual, in this episode, we will summarize and discuss some of last week's most interesting AI news. You can also check out our Last Week in AI newsletter at lastweekin.ai for articles we did not cover in this episode. I am one of your hosts, Andrei Kurenkov. I recently finished my PhD at Stanford, where I studied AI robotics, and I now work at a generative AI startup.
And hey, peeps, my name's Jeremy. I'm your other, co-founder, co-host. And I just
not a co-founder.
Not a co-founder. I jumped the ship. I think my brain's there. I was in San Francisco last week, which is why we kind of didn't have an episode, but sort of did, because we did that episode on AI safety where we
recorded it. I still haven't edited it, but it's coming out soon. XAI episode coming out probably within a week, so that's exciting.
Yeah, that was fun. That was a really fun chat, actually. So anyway, back in the saddle and excited for this latest iteration. There's definitely some interesting stuff happening around open source and like a cool trend, I think, around kind of self-alignment with language models and stuff like that we'll get to. Anyway, I don't want to spoil it. So anyway, Andre, you know what to do. You're one of the co-founders of this thing.
Well, first, actually, a quick programming note. We did skip one episode, but for any regular listeners, this might actually be a good thing. I'm going to try and bump up a release schedule. Instead of releasing on sort of Tuesdays, I'm going to try to make it so it's on Thursdays or Fridays. So we basically get to the news quicker. We usually lag by a decent amount of time between when the news story comes out and when we get an episode that discusses it. So we're recording this on Thursday. I'm going to try to get it out today or tomorrow. And then this stuff we'll be discussing will be pretty fresh.
I do want the fine people who listen to the Last Week in AI podcast, and by the way, you have great taste, to recognize Andre puts in so much work in the back end to like edit all this stuff and like prep the notes for like it is a huge amount of work. So, round of applause okay, they can't do it, but I'm just going to put it there. There you go.
Yeah, if only I could do my job, but surprisingly not yet. Speaking to our listeners, as always, we want to give a quick shout out to listener comments and corrections. I did get around to replying to a few emails. There's a lot of emails I still aim to reply to, but I haven't got around to. But there were a few people who specifically asked for an X-Risk episode, so that is now coming, which is cool. And we have a few new reviews on Apple Podcasts from Smart Aces and Chiang My Guy and Boomer AI Immigrant, which is fun. And it's nice positive comments, people that seem to appreciate this being kind of very detailed and long and kind of approachable. So thanks for the feedback. As always, you can leave us feedback by leaving a review on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, or email us at contact@lastweekin.ai with any thoughts, suggestions, or just feedback. Sometimes I don't get around to responding for a week or two, maybe even 3, but I do keep an eye out for that stuff. All right, so that is it for the intro. Let's get into news. Starting with tools and apps, we have AppS.ElevenLabs comes out of beta and releases 11 Multilingual v2 and a foundational AI speech model for nearly 30 languages. So AppS.ElevenLabs is probably the frontrunner for speech synthesis as far as online tools go. You input some text and you can select a voice, or you can add your own voice or someone else's voice, and the AI will make audio from the text that has that voice. And it is very good from what I've seen, from what I've actually played around with it. It is very good. And now apparently they're out of beta and they're releasing this new tool that supports many more languages. And I think it's a pretty big deal.
Yeah, it definitely seems that way. I did play around with this a little bit too. I was really impressed with how they preserved kind of the character, the essence, if you will, of the speaker in one language, and kind of ported that into the others. So there was like some consistency. It was as if the same person was speaking, and they're expanding their portfolio to include like a whole bunch of languages that seem very important that they didn't have before. So previously they had like English, Polish, German, Spanish, French, Italian, Hindi, and Portuguese. And now they're adding Chinese. So that's going to be a really big deal. And Japanese, I'm looking at some of the more popularly spoken one, classical Arabic, Tamil. Anyway, so it's really cool and speaks to that challenge that we've talked about on the show before of kind of getting models that can speak many different languages, because there's such a shortage of data for especially some of the rarer language, that you really need a model that's kind of primed already with a decent amount of training, usually on other languages, so it can benefit from kind of like what it's already learned, say reading English and Chinese text, as it goes on to learn those other languages. So really cool development.
Yeah, and I think for this sort of thing in particular, right, things like ChatGPT and most foundation models can do many languages, especially like big languages like Chinese, or other popular ones, Spanish, I suppose. They kind of learn that out of the box just by virtue of the web scraping that you get. But when you get to tasks that involve audio, like speech synthesis, right, that's not quite as easy to get data for. So then you need to be much more, let's say, deliberate about trying to get data to train your model to be able to speak all of these languages. And then you also get into all these complications of course, there's a big difference in the input alphabet for these things. So yeah, it's really impressive. And personally, I'm looking forward to even more memes from this of like the US presidents playing Minecraft or whatever. I'm a big fan. I've there's like the US presidents doing tier lists of video game characters. There's a lot of this stuff on YouTube.
Oh my God.
I always find it pretty hilarious.
Yeah, impressionists are going to be out of a job soon.
Yeah, at least as far as pure audio goes, for sure. Yeah. All right, next story. We got Meet Lilli, our generative AI tool that's a researcher, a time saver, and an inspiration. This is from McKinsey, the consulting group. And yeah, they have this tool called Lilli that is pretty much for search and synthesis of knowledge from McKinsey that I imagine they are going to sell to clients. So yeah, it's a new interface, I guess, to McKinsey Knowledge. I'm sure they publish many, many, many reports that you have to pay for. So I guess this is your easy way to browse all of that.
Yeah, and it's also kind of interesting. This is part of an ecosystem of consulting companies getting deeper into the kind of language modeling space. There was that big announcement. I think this was back in February or anywhere earlier in the year, where I think Bain, it was Bain and Company that partnered with OpenAI to kind of like do their big push into generative AI. So kind of interesting that McKinsey's gone the path here of doing some internal development, it seems, to set up their own system. And it matches like one strategy that we've seen, which is like the more closed source, like proprietary internal stuff that maybe contrasts with just, hey, like anybody can use our thing as an API. This is like, at least it's not clear whether it's going to be released as an API, as far as I can tell.
Yeah, I don't know if they explicitly talk about this, about how exactly the business model will be here. They seem to just announce the existence of this from what I've read. But yeah, it, as you say, is kind of more closed source. They say in this blog post that it is trained on the firm's intellectual property. So there will be more than 100,000 documents and interview transcripts containing both internal and third-party contact with all these experts and so on. So yeah, this is the sort of thing that I guess they'll try to sell to business leaders and so on. Also, fun fact, Lilli is named after Lillian Dombrowski, the first professional woman hired by McKinsey in 1945, who went on to become the controller and corporate secretary for the firm. So, cool name.
It continues a trend of like the naming of these AI systems being like kind of a big deal for some of these companies. Sort of interesting.
And moving on to the lightning round, we have Google tests an AI assistant that offers life advice. So that's pretty much the story, not too much here. Google is testing this thing that offers things like idea creation, tutoring, and planning. The safety experts have, of course, warned about this is probably not a good idea to offer life advice, given what we know about language models. So I'm sure this is just one of many, many experiments within Google on stuff they could release.
Yeah, and consistent with this whole racing dynamic that we've seen, especially sparked by ChatGPT's release, Google feels like they have no choice. They're having to rush these things out of production. So there's a sense in which all these ethical arguments that were made about caution with respect to technology like this are now kind of seem at least to be being waved off. Maybe that reflects some alignment improvements. Maybe it reflects some underlying technological shifts, but the vibe, at least of this article, seems to be that, hey, we're just going ahead with this now because of the racing dynamics. It's sort of interesting that they flagged, like the way they describe it, by the way, this tool kind of seems like a substitute. If you've ever been to Reddit, like relationship advice or one of those subreddits, it kind of made me think like, we've seen what's happened to Stack Overflow. Maybe with Reddit, is it possible we'll see death by 1,000 cuts with systems like this gradually chipping away at different subreddits, different threads and stuff like that, but sort of something that remains to be seen. I think it's another instance of like the kinds of ethical questions that come up in this AI arms race. I think that's the single biggest take home for me here.
Next story is Runway launches new watch feature as CEO says Hollywood AI discourse needs to be more nuanced. So we've touched on Runway a fair amount of times. It's a company that is releasing AI tools for video creation for the most part. So they do video editing, video special effects, lots of this sort of stuff. There's a whole suite of things. They do text to video, which we've covered a couple times. And yeah, this article is about this new feature they have that allows people to watch things, and there's not much more on this feature. It just allows users to share and consume longer form videos that are created with Runway tools. The rest of the article is really an overview about Runway, its history, and so on. It's a pretty good overview, but as far as news, there's not much beyond this feature.
And next, we have the AI-powered Adobe Express is now generally available. So this is these new AI-powered features in Adobe Express that previously were only available, in beta, now are being released more broadly. They've released features that are powered by their generative model Firefly. So we've talked about Firefly in previous episodes. Now I'm trying to remember. Do you remember if Firefly is it generates images, right? Okay, cool. So Firefly is a generative model that produces images. And if I recall correctly, actually, this was the one that Adobe was leaning on to make their claim that, hey, you know what, we will indemnify anyone who uses our generated images. You don't need to worry about getting sued for copyright. We'll support you in court, basically, if you do get sued. So this is kind of the broader rollout. Maybe if that indemnification thing holds, if they're still offering that to their customers, maybe this increases their legal exposure in some way. I'm not exactly sure what the details of the indemnity story are with respect to this because they don't necessarily talk about it. But it'll be really interesting from a legal standpoint to see where Firefly ends up going.
Yeah, it's a pretty affordable monthly subscription. I'm not sure exactly the price. They have a $10 tier. I'm not sure if that includes the generative AI. But either way, this is a nice, accessible, well-made tool for image editing and text to image that I imagine many professionals will opt for instead of, let's say, more not Adobe-esque software like Midjourney that you have to use for Discord or something. Next, we have Snapchat is expanding further into generative AI with Dreams. So there's a new feature in Snapchat that is Dreams. Users will be able to take or upload selfies, and the app will generate new pictures of them in imaginative backgrounds that just places users in these fantastical places and scenarios. Kind of a no-brainer, I would say, and I guess a lot of people will be playing around with this coming forward.
Yeah, and they do talk about sort of similar apps that are already on the App Store, and highlight one called Rimini, which I actually missed this story. So apparently it went viral on TikTok last month. People figured out that they could like take their selfies and use those selfies via this app to turn them into professional looking headshots. They don't have to pay for like a pro shoot. That's kind of interesting, especially as you start to think about the interactions between different apps and tools. Things can get automated all of a sudden when you combine things together. So kind of cool. But yeah, not much more to this. And I agree, kind of something you would expect to happen naturally.
Yeah, I think the one thing that is interesting to me is, as we've often touched on, the economics of this, because as with language models, image generation relies on pretty significant compute. You need to pay for GPUs in the cloud. And when you have a massive, hundreds of millions of users, user base, and you allow all of them to create these AI images, that is a lot of money. So it'll be interesting to see what they do here. Are they going to lock this behind a paywall for a premium tier? Are they going to limit your ability to create these things? I'm curious to see how that goes.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. It's kind of like, it makes me think of how venture capital often like subsidizes startups like Uber for a really long time, and effectively like their money becomes our money as we get to consume these products for less than they actually cost to produce. And here, like for Uber, it makes sense because you're saying, okay, we'll build up a critical mass. We'll have a marketplace, and by the time we start charging, it's almost impossible for people to go off platform or whatever. Obviously, Lyft kind of challenges that idea, but this is sort of challenging because you want to be the first mover, but it's not necessarily clear how much of a moat that buys you, just because it becomes 6 months later so much cheaper for other people to do the exact same thing as the price of compute goes down. So like, yeah, I'm really curious, like what the equation is going to turn out to be, whether in retrospect we'll see this as like an almost reckless use of funds. But hey, these experiments have got to be run. So we're going to find out.
Indeed. I think this is not quite out yet. This article is about, it is forthcoming, but as you say, it's going to be here soon. And the last story for this section, we have NCSoft's new AI suite is trained to streamline game production. I found this to be pretty interesting. NCSoft is a Korean video game company, and it has developed 4 new AI large language models. And this suite is called, they have Varco LLM, Varco Art, Varco Text, and Varco Human. So they're not all language models actually. And these tools generate lifelike NPCs, non-playable characters, storylines, dialogue, and digital humans. So this is for generating text, 2D art, 3D modeling, kind of a lot of stuff. And looking at the article, it's pretty impressive to see the suite.
Yeah, and very specific application of this stuff. Something too that falls very much in your area, Andre, with the video game. But I guess you can't. I'm curious, as a guy who focuses on exactly this space. Do you find yourself looking actively for tools like this on a day-to-day, or is the platform switch too much? Is the lift too much? Like what does that look like in your workflow?
Yeah, so I do work at a company that is using generative AI for video games. I won't, disclose any secrets, but let's just say if you look at things like Midjourney or some of these other existing things, it's surprising how bad they are at actually creating usable assets. Like they're not optimized to be really usable in, let's say, video game production. They can give you good concept art, but not something you just plop in a game. So I'm curious to see if that is something they fixed to this, or if it's just another kind of pretty much off-the-shelf 2D image generator. But definitely for some of this 3D modeling stuff and so on, it looks like beyond anything I've seen in this realm.
Interesting. All right, well, moving on to applications in business now, we have Gartner places generative AI on the peak of inflated expectations on the 2023 hype cycle for emerging technologies. And I will always say this, anytime I'm looking for cutting edge, relevant input on the state of generative AI, I think I got to go talk to a big consulting company. So Gartner, this is their opinion. I take this so seriously. Anyway, no, Gartner's great. No shade on Gartner. I'm just joking around. All right. They've got their hype cycle. So just to kind of, if you haven't seen these things before, they're like the classic consultant diagram of like, you've got early stage innovations that have really kind of low expectations. People aren't super tracking them. They're not hyped up. So here they put things like neuro-symbolic AI, augmented FinOps, so I guess fintech operations, all kinds of stuff that people aren't super jazzed about. And then essentially they move up the hype cycle essentially. So expectations as these technologies mature go up at first. And so at the very peak, you've got things like cloud native AI augmented software engineering. So you can think there are things like Codex, and then generative AI more broadly. I don't know why those are split up quite the way they are because one seems to include the other. But anyway, there's API-centric SaaS. There's a bunch of stuff. That's at the peak. And then on the other end, as these technologies mature more, the idea is that eventually you kind of like see the rubber meet the road and you go, oh, this thing did not actually turn into the world-changing technology that I expected it to. And so you enter the trough of disillusionment. And then a little bit later, you kind of rediscover these things as they mature even more and then actually start to solve real-world use cases, eventually reaching what is known as the plateau of productivity. Not all tech, needless to say, actually follows this kind of cycle, but this is just kind of an aid to conceptualize things. And so Gartner's argument here is that generative AI and kind of similarly AI augmented software engineering, which is a subset of it, are right at the peak. Like basically people are fired up about them. The implication seems to be that we are about to see a real crash in expectations from these systems as they mature a little bit more. You'd expect them to reach the trough of disillusionment phase. So that's kind of this interesting question. I think part of what we talked about, right, Andre, in our AI X Risk episode, really part of that implicitly was, are we in that stage of inflated expectations? Is generative AI actually going to pay off in the next 2 to 3 years? I think this is an interesting question. I tend to fall on a different side of the coin, I think, from Gartner on this one. Though I think some applications probably are. We just talked about a couple, right? The cost to benefit of using highly expensive computational resources to churn out like images that maybe don't necessarily have enough value added to justify it. But I think one of the key questions is, how quickly will the market figure out which applications to channel that expensive compute into and which to use, say, cheaper models or no models at all, and just kind of wait for the computations to become cheaper overall?
Yeah, I thought this was a nice article to highlight more as an excuse for us to chat about it than anything particularly interesting or deep here. I mean, of course, a lot of people did point to this. I agree that you can easily debate and discuss this particular choice. I think the notion that AI augmented software engineering is going to go through a trough is probably not true. It's like just already here. It's already at this so-called plateau of productivity where people are just, it's actually useful. So in my mind, as far as I understand, this trough or disillusionment is like, you expect the technology to revolutionize or immediately have impact, and then you realize that it requires more development and so on. Some aspects of generative AI, sure, I think that's true. Other aspects, not so much. Of course, we know like speech synthesis, a lot of things are going full steam ahead, and I don't think there will be much disillusionment. So yeah, generative AI is just way too broad a label. I think in some cases you definitely can slow down a bit. Things like, let's say, therapy. I don't know that. Yeah, but for many other things like software engineering, like translation, obviously, which I guess already was the case to some extent, like writing marketing copy or researching legal briefs. It's just already here, and it's only being expanded and approved by various players. So it's just like not a great fit for this particular model, but it's a fun little thought exercise.
Well, but that itself, I think, is really interesting, right? Like, why is it? Because it seems it's not that all technologies follow this kind of curve where there's like hype and then there's a crash, and then eventually over time, long after people have forgotten about the hype, it kind of reemerges. Not all technologies follow that, but a lot of them do. I think it's interesting that certain forms of generative AI do seem to have flipped from nobody's ever heard of this to like it's now in everybody's day-to-day workflow. It's literally causing the kind of stock value of Stack Overflow to crash by 50%. Like that's how pervasive it is. I wonder if like part of this is, if you think about the space of products that's historically been accessible to us, we've always had technologists like startup founders reaching for something that's just within reach technologically, and then just building their way to that slightly out of reach thing. Whereas here, it's almost like the cheapness of compute, the abundance of compute, and our ability to channel it into useful things using things like transformers, all of a sudden unlocked a whole new subspace that we'd never touched before, like very green pastures. And in that massive space, basically, like we find ourselves with tons of technological overhang. So we can all of a sudden do this like a la carte menu, of super valuable things like, language translation. Hey, that's all, generative AI now, or at least the best ways to do it. Like you said, the mid-journey stuff, the marketing copywriting, the coding, like all that stuff. It seems like it all came all of a sudden. And in a sense, I suspect it's because it's on the back of really like this one technological innovation, which is compute getting a lot cheaper. And yes, there's a bunch of stuff around transformers too. I don't want to downgrade the importance of that, but it's sort of like this one set of technologies that's enabled a cluster of things. And that's different from what we've seen historically, maybe electricity, maybe other things like that, general purpose technologies. But I wonder if that's kind of part of it here.
Yeah, I feel like I actually can think of this as a little more gradual. I do wonder if, if you look at this graph, it starts at 0, then it climbs up and it reaches a peak and it goes down. I would probably put this start around GPT-2. GPT-2
Right.
was, for people keeping up with AI, was like the first moment there was a hint of the power of this sort of generative AI, I would say. And even before that, we have GANs that were discussed a lot with deepfakes and so on. So I think there was a bit of a, let's say, slightly more gradual transition, and people were starting to explore these things in 2021. 2022 was already kind of accelerating. And maybe like the key point that feels true in this article is that now we are at the peak. Like, can you get any more hype as far as where we are? It doesn't seem like it, but I think it's been a bit of a road that may not be apparent.
That's a really good point. It's almost like it depends on the community that you're thinking about. Like academics and AI people were like super jazzed about GPT-2 back then. And yeah, we probably went through this phase. We're like, holy shit, like, GPT-3 is going to be the blah, blah, blah. And it turned out not to be, maybe for us, GPT-3 or GPT-2 is the peak of inflated expectations. And then, but it kind of seems like for the general public, we're both seeing the hype and the productivity at the same time. And I think that's part of what makes this so confusing.
Yeah. Well, I guess you can feel free to make up your own mind, listeners. Moving on, we have the State of AI Quarter 2 2023 report from CB Insights, a bunch of economic stats. So we'll just go through them real quick. There's a stat that global AI funding for the second quarter dropped 38% quarter over quarter. But if you exclude OpenAI's mega, ridiculous round of however many billion it was, without that, it actually has grown by 81%. Deals to AI startups increased for the first time in 5 quarters. And of course, that has to do with the economic conditions that's been around. Last year was not a great time for startups. So there were 590 deals in quarter 2, with 40 of those being a US-based startups. Generative AI companies attracted 4 of the top 5 largest funding rounds in Q2. The average deal size for AI companies in 2023 grew nearly 50%. Basically, AI companies are getting more money by quite a bit.
Yeah, and I think this whole space it's so interesting, like the funding space. By the way, funny that they had to exclude OpenAI's mega round from last year just to kind of like make the numbers make sense. And I think that is, there's one question around that, which is pretty fundamental. Like, should you include those sorts of rounds? In other words, are the big rounds to some extent some of the only ones that matter? Like, if it's the case that over long time horizons, the scale issue just becomes critical, and companies that have a moat hit escape velocity with scale, then OpenAI's mega round really becomes one of the only events that matters. If, on the other hand, you think that the space is a lot more dynamic and that in the long run, companies like Adept AI, as sort of smaller companies with a little bit less funding, Cohere, for example, I'm saying smaller, I mean some of these companies raise on billion-dollar valuations plus. Then you start to think, okay, the smaller landscape matters more. And that's a fundamental question that I think investors are still trying to answer. And there's, a lot of confusion, at least at my end as well, in terms of what's right there.
Yeah, I think it really depends on what you're tracking. So the funding round was actually $10 billion for OpenAI last quarter.
Yeah.
And in last quarter, the total was $15.2 billion. This quarter, the funding number was $9.4 billion. So if you're looking at sort of a space of how many companies are active, how many new players are coming in, how much investing there is in general, then you probably want to exclude that number because it is an outlier. It's Microsoft, I think, for the most part, given money to OpenAI. So it's not really tracking that general trend, let's say. But yeah, I mean, obviously, I think OpenAI is in the lead as far as competitors in the space because they got $10 billion.
Yeah, I guess what I'm getting at though is there's sort of like this story you could tell about the landscape of AI that ultimately labs like Google and Google DeepMind now and OpenAI are really like the only ones that may matter in the long run, or that there's some threshold of funding above which you've like hit escape velocity, and now you can afford, for example, enough servers to train the next, or enough GPUs rather, to train the next big model that will bring in enough money to build the next big model, and so on. And that below that threshold, you're kind of like, now you're in gradual death mode. And it's sort of unclear, number one, if that threshold exists at all. And number two, where to put it. And there certainly is a story that says, actually, that threshold is on the order of billions of dollars of funding, in which case you look at the OpenAI thing as basically the only investment that matters in the long run. That may be a pretty extreme view, and people will differ on that. But like, I think this is a fascinating question as to whether you count that, whether you don't, whether you count nothing else, like what actually seems to matter in this space.
Yeah, I think to put it in perspective, the average deal size for AI companies in 2023 so far is 29 million. So that's actually 50% more than last year, but still obviously not billions. There are startups like Inflection AI, Cohere, and Anthropic that get 100 million or more mega rounds, hundreds of millions, as we've covered, even $1 billion, although 10 billion, I think, is pretty much just OpenAI. And so just some more numbers. There's a lot of interesting stuff here. The AI sector has seen 7 new companies reach the 1 billion valuation mark this quarter. 5 of those are generative AI. So that can be Cohere, Replit, Runway, which we just discussed, Synthesia, and Typeface. 5 of those are in the US, 1 is in the UK, and one is in Canada.
Yeah.
I think Cohere, right?
Yeah, so Cohere, that's right.
We've touched on that. And apparently Canada is doing pretty well, actually. They've seen a surge in AI funding growing by 1,000% quarter over quarter, which I think it might be Cohere as well.
Yeah, I was going to say, it's like, if we're in the business of counting or not counting things, yeah. It's also like, I wonder who, if I recall, Well, I think Cohere, if I'm not wrong, they have raised from some Canadian VCs. I'm curious, like one of the golden rules of Canadian VC is that we always miss all of the important opportunities. So like, in my hometown of Ottawa, Canada, you could say that investors, like seed stage investors, had one job over the last 20 years. Their only job was to invest in Shopify. Any other decision that they made was a complete waste of time relative to investing in Shopify. And did they do it? Of course they didn't, because they're like, they're super risk averse. They like have all the wrong metrics. They don't think like kind of Silicon Valley VCs. So Shopify goes down there to raise. I'm curious. I believe something similar may have happened with Cohere. I don't want to eat my words, but I'm pretty sure. I'm just going to look them up on Crunchbase. Yeah. Yeah, that's right. So they're big funders for their Series C round. And I'm trying to. Innovia Capital, I actually can't remember where they're based. I would guess in the US, but it's like Index Ventures, Oracle, Nvidia, like SAP. These are like all US based firms. So there we go again. Yay. Oh, Canada. And now starting our lightning round, we have China GPT ? Tencent to unleash homegrown AI as big tech races for supremacy. And so we've seen, obviously, a bunch of Chinese companies, Alibaba in particular, kind of create their own homegrown, like large language models. And this is Tencent saying, hey, we're going to do that too. So they basically are saying that there's going to be a new foundation model they'll put out later this year. So it's not about a model that they have actually built, but they are saying it will be, quote, among the best in China. So a lot of kind of promises being made. It's unclear if they'll be among the best in China when it comes out, or if their future model will be better than the current generation in China. But anyway, the model is one that they've named Hunyuan, which is going to be tested across gaming, advertising, cloud computing, fintech, a whole bunch of applications for this thing. And one thing to keep in mind too is Tencent has been perceived as not necessarily being like the leading Chinese generative AI company. It's sort of lagged behind. We had Baidu that built, I think they built the first, if I'm not wrong, the first Chinese generative AI model back in the day. We had Inspur with Source 1.0 or UN 1.0. So a bunch of like Chinese companies have been in this game for a long time. And Tencent's kind of been this like weird exception to that race. I mean, I've been surprised not to see them put something out. So here they are. And this is as well on the heels of Alibaba releasing Qwen 7 billion and Qwen 7 billion chat. So two open source models to compete with the Llama series. And so, I don't know how much that would have triggered this announcement, but I will say it seems a little weird that they're announcing a model that has not yet been built yet. We will see that story again later today with another American company. But that, seems like I don't know how to put this. It seems like more of maybe a marketing play than a, typical product play.
Yeah, I think we discussed very recently Alibaba releasing these two open sourced AI models, Qwen 7B and 7B Chat. They also had the 70 billion models. So I do feel like this could just be a sort of reactive thing of like, oh, we're working on AI too. Next, what you need to know about Sakana AI, the new startup from a transformer paper co-author. I love that it goes in the headline. This is from VentureBeat. So Lillian Jones, one of these co-authors of the famous paper, Attention is All You Need, which led arguably to all the stuff, has left to co-found Sakana AI in Tokyo. And this is kind of an interesting company. It is pursuing a biomimicry approach, drawing inspiration from collective intelligence in nature, like basically swarms, like ants or various other insects. And they plan to use this kind of different approach to create generative AI models. Not too clear how much, there is to this beyond that, how much clarity there is. But that's the story.
Yeah, they were answering questions about whether they're using language models, and they seem to say like, we don't know, maybe, kind of, yeah, probably. I mean, like everybody's using them; they'll be part of the future. That was kind of the vibe. So it seems like they're fairly unsettled in their own minds what they'll be using. Probably this is like, they have a sense. I don't know. In my mind, it's something like we have a sense of like, architecturally how to do this, but we don't know where we'll get our world model from. So we're not sure if it's a language model we'll use. I don't know. But kind of interesting. They do mention that the founder, Lion Jones, is going to be joined by the former head of research at Stability AI, David Ha, which is kind of interesting in and of itself for what it implies about Stability AI's perceived trajectory if their head of research is jumping ship to do this. But yeah, and I think also interesting that they're basing it in Tokyo. Like, I don't know what the play is there. They may perceive that there's an untapped talent pool there. Maybe the language barrier makes it harder for people to then like leave your company and go join another, because that's been a real issue for startups in the generative AI space. I'm sure Andre fields requests from other companies all the time. He's a very impressive young man.
Wow, I wouldn't build myself up quite that high, but yeah, I think a lot of it is. I just think these two people are based in Japan. I know David Ha has been presumably also Lion Jones, so that I think could be part of it. Of course, there's other metrics here. I'm sure probably they could get a lot of support and backing as one of the more prominent, founders in the space. But yeah, it's curious because it seems like more of an R&D thing rather than a proper, let's say, business startup, as far as I can tell.
Yeah, it really does. And that's always one of the things, when you talk to people who do go out and found some of these, especially the bigger generative AI companies, like their big question about geography is always like talent, and to some degree, national support locally. So, maybe being the differentiated, like the Japanese generative AI company, maybe at this point that's worth it because you're not facing the same competition that you would in the US, say. But there was one thing they said about their departure from Google, in the context of like, well, couldn't you have done this at Google, something like that? And they were saying it's just a side effect of big company itis. And that seems to be, maybe valid applying to Google generally. Not so sure it would apply to DeepMind quite the same way. They said that it's also an issue for OpenAI, which I found really, I'm not sure I agree with that claim. OpenAI still has just a few hundred employees. I've certainly faced this pressure when fundraising. You always want to tell the story that like, all these big companies are too slow, whatever. All our competitors are either too big or incompetent or whatever. I think, OpenAI seems to be just like a tough one for a lot of these newly founded kind of take over the world AGI type companies to argue around.
Well, I think they also said that Google's focus on large language models in particular was a mistake. They say because that's restrictive. So in that sense, I think that's very true of OpenAI as well. And I think even within AI research, this sort of nature-inspired approach is fairly niche. So it'll be interesting to see what they do. Yeah, evolutionary computing is pretty awesome, but also not very, let's say, productized anywhere.
It's been around for a while too, eh? And up next, we have AI startup Anthropic raises $100 million from Korean telco giant SK Telecom. So if you are not Korean, you've never heard of SK Telecom, one thing that's worth noting is that that Korea kind of has, South Korea obviously has a sort of oligopoly. So there are only a couple of big companies that sort of like own all the tech companies. Samsung, of course, is the number one, and the number two arguably is SK Telecom. And they are known for making investments that are kind of like, how would you say, like swinging for the fences, like taking really big gambles that don't always pay off, but are meant to be really kind of risky. And here they're investing. It's kind of interesting. It's like an investment deal, but they're investing in Anthropic with the understanding that that Anthropic is going to build with them a new model. And so this is a $100 million investment. I think it's really interesting because it's not necessarily a positive sign for Anthropic. Like normally, if you're doing really well in this space, especially in a take over the world space like AGI, you would probably be raising without weird terms like this. Like this is the sort of thing that you do to kind of, it's also, you look at SK Telecom, that's a little bit of an unusual investor too. So it's not like they're raising from Sequoia or some other fund. So putting these things together, we know Anthropic has already raised $450 million in its Series C, about 3 months ago. And so now they're raising a smaller round with this kind of weird edge case. I'm not saying that's the case, and I personally love Anthropic, but it kind of seems a little odd, and it maybe raises a bit of an alarm bell in my mind. But who knows? Could be wrong.
I agree. It's kind of interesting, a bit surprising to highlight. For anyone who hasn't been keeping up, Anthropic is basically the main competitor of OpenAI. Their Claude model is pretty much state of the art, maybe the only one that's really at the level of ChatGPT. And it's curious, why did they go for this after so recently getting another round? Maybe they want to get more global investment. It's not too obvious, but regardless, now they have more money, and I'm sure 100 million won't hurt.
That's true. Actually, one little detail I noticed too was Jared Kaplan, who is their I'm trying to remember if I think he's Anthropic's like head of research, or he's their head of R&D or something. He's also the co-author of the Scaling Laws for Neural Language Models paper from 2019, just before GPT-3. He's apparently going to be like taking the lead on this product line. So again, it kind of seems weird to me that like you're going to like pull such a powerful asset in the direction of working on something like this. But again, could be wrong. Just
Last story for the section: OpenAI acquires AI design studio Global Illumination. So OpenAI has acquired this company. It's a New York-based startup with only around 8 employees. It's the first public acquisition in the 7-year history of OpenAI. And supposedly the team will join OpenAI to work on core products. Not too much stated about this. If you do go to the Global Illumination website, there's really not much there. It lists these 8 employees and has a link to a game called Biomes, which is an open source sandbox MMORPG, sort of like Minecraft. So maybe they'll go into making a game. It's not clear.
that was one of the things I was trying to figure out, right? Like OpenAI seems to be one thing they seem to have been doing less of recently is the game playing stuff, the kind of Dota 2 line of effort. I'm not sure where that is, if they're just like, doubling down on language models. But the article said like the game's fate is unclear, but one would presume that the team's work at OpenAI will have less of an entertainment bent. Seems like that makes sense. I maybe wonder if, we've seen Minecraft be used as a gaming environment for a lot of really cool models. So maybe the idea here is that they can help to engineer these sorts of training environments that are more open-ended. We'll see. It is interesting that this is OpenAI's first acquisition throughout all of its history. We don't know the terms, so we don't know the valuation or anything else. But one of the things that this makes me think of is like, if you're spending a lot of money doing an acquisition like this at a time when liquidity is really low, interest rates are high, people are less likely to spend, those dollars are, pretty valuable. And they close anyway, the article through that lens saying that OpenAI made $30 million in actual hard cash last year. They're expecting to get to 200 million this year and 1 billion next year. So, if that plays out, that's some fast growth.
And moving to projects and open source, starting with AI2 OLMo, an open language model made by scientists for scientists. So the Allen Institute for AI has created this new model, AI2 OLMo, that will have 70 billion parameters and expected to release in early 2024. It will be an open source language model that provides access and education to the research community, with all the elements of a project being made accessible, including data, code, training curves, and evaluation benchmarks. So truly open source. It's being developed in collaboration with AMD and CSC, using some supercomputer, and also partnering with Surgery and Mosaic ML for data and training code. So just based on that, it seems like, yes, it's not out yet, but these partnerships make this a pretty big deal. It seems very likely to actually come about.
Yeah, and actually, just for clarity, it hasn't been built yet, but it is in production apparently.
Right.
So early 2024, they think it'll come out. I think this is kind of interesting. I mean, the Allen Institute for AI was co-founded by one of the founders of Microsoft, and they've got this like sort of nonprofit mission to like, make AI more accessible and so on. I think that it's an interesting play. I'm curious about how relevant this model will be when it comes out. One of the challenges that they're running into, and you kind of can read this in the blog post, is like they're trying to stake out a position where they are the open source people, but Meta's sort of already the open source people, and they're pumping out models, I suspect, that are going to be considerably better than, I could be wrong, but that seem at least positioned to be kind of better than this category. And so the dimension they seem to be distinguishing themselves on is like, okay, yeah, Meta's open source, but we're really, really open source. Like, look how open source we are. We're so open source, man. And the way that they explain that is by saying like you said, I mean, we're going to absolutely open source everything, not only our data, but the code. We'll release the model, the training curves, evaluation benchmarks. We'll openly share and discuss the ethical and educational consideration. Like, all this stuff has more or less already been done. And I suspect more and more of it will be done by the time this model comes out. So interesting to see this push. And make no mistake, the Allen Institute for AI is a real legit player. And to your point, Andre, like absolutely, like those collaborations, especially with AMD, big deal. I think it's an interesting question as to whether this is going to be materially better than what we see at that point.
Yeah, it definitely is. As you said, this is a real player. Allen Institute has been around for a long time. I think we covered one of its research papers. It was one of the early papers to explore LLMs with tools, actually. They had this quite a while ago. So yeah, it's an interesting question of whether with Llama 2 and Falcon already being here, this will actually make a big dent, or if because they really, specifically create this for science and research, whether that might, actually make a big difference. And I think it might be the case if you really make it such that it's meant to be analyzed and studied and so on. Could be a differentiator. We'll see.
And next we have introducing, and I'm going to pronounce this correctly, by the way. I'll explain why in a minute. Introducing IDEFICS, an open reproduction of state-of-the-art visual language model. So I'm French Canadian. When I see a little pun on the Astérix et Obélix series, which is the Asterix and Obelix series for you Anglo bastards, I will call it out. So it's essentially IDEFICS is one of the characters. I think it's the dog from this series of comic books. And essentially what they're doing here is they're taking, they're reproducing Flamingo, basically. So Flamingo was this model that DeepMind made quite a while ago now that is private still. And what they've done, so this model can take in text and image inputs, and then it can only generate text outputs. And so the sorts of things you could do with this that you couldn't do with, say, like a GPT 3.5 is give it an image of some like blueprint or something, and then ask it a question about the blueprint, and it could answer those questions, for instance. So a really interesting modality, and now kind of moving into the open source. We haven't seen especially good models that can do this before, so that's kind of exciting. And the way they're doing this is by combining together Llama 1, the OG Llama, and another model called OpenClip. So Clip, you might recall, was the OpenAI model way back in the day that was open sourced, that essentially allowed you to caption in images. So basically do image semantics, image understanding. So they're combining OpenClip, which is a more recent open source version of it, with Llama. And in between, they have a layer of weights that they're training themselves to kind of be the glue that maps Llama, the language understanding piece, onto the vision image understanding piece, Clip. And the whole thing goes up to 80 billion parameters. They've got two different models. One is 9 and the other is 80. So pretty interesting development. Hugging Face, obviously, really big into open source these days. So it's kind of a noteworthy project. And one of the things they really lean on here is everything is open source, and that includes the data set. No risk, presumably, of copyright infringement. This is a kind of open source on top of open source type of project. Again, very consistent with the Hugging Face philosophy.
Yeah, they also released this new 115 billion token dataset called Obelix. So it's a mix of these openly available datasets, Wikipedia, public multimodal dataset, Lion, and now this new, very, very big, this new Obelix thing consists of. I'm assuming Obelix has like another French pronunciation.
It is, but you're right. That's right.
Yeah. It consists of 141 interleaved image text documents and contains 353 million images, just for context. So yeah, it's huge. This is as good as this Flamingo model from DeepMind. There's a research paper. There are insights and learnings from the model's training. So yeah, really cool for researchers, but it is built on Llama 1, so it's not commercial.
Yeah, and this is making me wonder. So Flamingo came out in April 2022, apparently. So we're now, we're August 2023. So yeah, so about a year and a half between Flamingo, privately being developed by DeepMind, and now open source replication. Kind of tracks, the timelines that we've seen historically. Kind of an interesting data point there.
Yeah, it's there's also Open Flamingo, which I think came out earlier. Mm-hmm. This one is actually 9 billion and 80 billion parameter sized. So if you want to go big, you can really go big with this one. Last story, introducing ArthurBench, the most robust way to evaluate large language models. So this is from the company Arthur, and they've developed a suite of monitoring tools for LLMs to help businesses integrate them into their operations. So this benchmark tool suite is an open source evaluation tool that allows businesses to compare LLMs, prompts, and hyperparameters, and so on. I think this is somewhat interesting to highlight, just because we have touched on, it's kind of hard to evaluate large language models. You can have task-specific things, but, is this as good as ChatGPT is kind of a hard question to answer.
Absolutely. And one of the themes that we've touched on, I think, in previous episodes is this question of how essential is language model search going to be? You imagine for any given task you have, there's probably a weirdly fine-tuned language model, open source, that already exists for you to use. And finding it is like finding a needle in a haystack. And so because you can't find it, you might go to a GPT-4, a paid model that's generally very capable. So it's like a catch-all, but that may not be as good as it's possible to be, or as cheap as it's possible to be for your application. And so anyway, it's interesting to see this as a continuation of that, a bet on the idea that helping people to quickly and robustly evaluate their language models is part of that search process. So,
yeah, and actually related to that, they also unveiled the Generative Assessment project, which is more of a research initiative. It's not a tool that is meant to explore the strengths and weaknesses of the language models from industry leaders like OpenAI, Anthropic, and Meta. And yeah, it's really kind of comparing and contrasting. They have a couple of things out already, comparing, for instance, hallucination of which top LLMs seem to hallucinate more or less, which one hedge on answers instead of actually giving an answer. So yeah, very interesting.
Yeah, actually, that's interesting. I hadn't checked out the hallucinations one. It's quite interesting. Yeah, because this is a comparison that I haven't seen done before with especially the proprietary models, right? Because we don't see the detailed papers. We see technical reports now. We don't see that level of openness. So yeah, seeing these side by side is quite interesting. And they're big differences. I'm surprised at how big these differences are actually. Yeah, hallucination wise, I'm just looking here and it's Claude 2 seems to hallucinate less than GPT-4. But it avoids answering a lot more often. It's all the stuff that if you've used these models, you'll kind of be yeah, I already kind of knew that, but it's cool to see it validated. This is a really cool experiment, actually.
Yeah, so Arthur, good job.
All right, we're moving on to research and advancements now. And our first paper is called Self-Alignment with Instruction Back Translation. And this is a paper from Meta, or Meta AI. So quite interesting. And sort of a simple idea in a weird way that works weirdly well. So the idea here is, okay, you have a base model, like let's say a glorified text autocomplete system. You train it to do autocomplete on the whole internet. And it's really, really good at autocomplete, just like GPT-3 was back in the day. But we don't necessarily want just an autocomplete system. And so we want one that we can interact with more naturally, that we can give plain language instructions to, and that model will just execute those instructions. In order to do that, you need to do something called instruction fine-tuning. Basically train the model with a bunch of instructions and then the response to those instructions, and get the model to kind of index really heavily on that type of interaction. So fine-tune it on that data set, then it'll get good at that stuff. Good. That's called instruction fine-tuning. Now, this is kind of addressing a really interesting challenge in this sort of fine-tuning, where the availability of that data is quite limited. It's like really hard to find big data sets with like, instructions and then the execution of those instructions, because, well, that takes a lot of time for humans to produce. And so Meta here is going to ask the question, okay, how about this? What if we take a small number of those sorts of examples where we have an instruction and we have an execution on that instruction? We use that to kind of prime the pump, train the model a little bit on that. And then we're going to introduce documents, a set of documents pulled from all over the internet. Maybe some of these are like medical documents, whatever. And what we'll do is we'll actually ask our language model to generate an instruction that it could imagine being useful with respect to that document. So, for example, I don't know, you have a document that explains the the plot of a movie, and then you might have it generate then an instruction like who's the main character, or like describe the relationship between the main characters. Right? That would be an instruction that makes sense given that document. And so it's going to look at all these documents. For each one, it's going to generate instructions that it thinks make sense, and it's going to generate the responses to those instructions. Now, then you're going to essentially train it on its own generated data set. But before you do, you're also going to get it to rank the instructions that it has generated. And it's going to pick the top ones, the ones that it thinks are most useful, and only retrain on those. And that seems to be the key that really allows this whole loop to come alive. So give it a bunch of new documents, have it generate a whole bunch of different instructions and their potential completions for that document, and then have the language model itself review its own generated data and filter it out, filter all the crap, and then pick only the best ones, and then retrain itself on the best ones. This is a really interesting dynamic. I'm still kind of trying to figure out why this works, because one of the things we've talked about actually on the show before is this idea of collapse, where if you train a language model on its own output or on other AI-generated text, like eventually it degrades into like just a gibberish spewing machine. It kind of spins out. That doesn't seem to happen here, at least for this fine-tuning task. I think the fact that it's fine-tuning, the fact that we're only looking at instruction following might be part of this. I think another part of this is probably also the stack ranking and filtering, where the model's kind of getting to use its expertise at filtering to inform how it generates. So kind of trading off skills, maybe adding a little information in the process. But this is actually, I think, a pretty fundamentally interesting paper. And DeepMind's come out with a similar one with RL, I think, earlier this week. We're talking about this one, but kind of similar idea. Models generating their own training data and using some sort of filtering approach like this.
Exactly. Yeah, if you look at the statistics, it's pretty impressive. They start out with these 300 examples, and then they generate 500,000 examples to train on these instructions. And if you look at the results, they are pretty surprising. With instruction fine-tuning just based on this data, they compare to Falcon Instruct, to Claude, to Guanaco, some of these models, and more often than not, this model does better than all of them, or as good, especially compared to Falcon Instruct. But even compared to Claude, this model is better 60% of the time, supposedly, in terms of being preferable. So surprisingly impressive results, and it, I guess, goes to show still how much we don't know, right? Because we've also seen things like fine-tuning on like textbooks and selecting very few high quality instructions. So it's just sort of still pretty mysterious. And this is showing something that works, but why does it work? Why do other things not work?
Yeah, absolutely. And like to add fuel to the fire, there's this really interesting figure where they kind of show, okay, like for different data set sizes, what is the lift that you get with your stack filtering, basically. So if you go through and be more picky about how high up in the rankings a generated piece of instruction tuning data has to be before you actually retrain on it, what they find is as the data set size increases, first of all, if you do no self-curation, then essentially you're just repeating the same collapse experiments we've seen before. So you don't improve at all, you get a little bit worse. If you do start to stack rank and then select, the more selective you are, the better the outcome, like the better this thing scales with more and more data. And what we're seeing is as you grow the size of that synthetic data set, the performance just keeps going up and up and up. And that kind of ties into something we've even heard Sam Altman say, where he's starting to speculate about, maybe at some point we reach a point where our models have enough latent knowledge that they can generate data that they kind of that's good enough for them to self-improve in this way. He was referring to that as the synthetic data event horizon. And this is still fine-tuning. This is still a very specific example. But it makes me wonder a little bit, are we reaching that point in some dimensions of the training process? That's more speculative, obviously. But to your point, Andre, that's part of the question set that we're left. Like, there's so much we don't know about how these things work.
Yeah, I'll do one piece of speculation, and I think also the unlabeled data part of this is maybe important. The fact that they don't just generate things from scratch, they have external data that's coming in. Right, is an important piece of this. But yeah, definitely this paper made, I think, some waves and is pretty interesting. And I found also probably related to this, it's interesting to note there was also a survey called Automatically Correcting Large Language Models, surveying the landscape of diverse self-correction strategies. So this is a survey that covers dozens of papers with many different approaches related to self-training, self-refining, reinforcement learning, etc. Very long summary. So if this is of interest to you, take a look at that. Next paper, DeepMind's AlphaStar benchmark improves a REL offline agent with 90% win rate against the state-of-the-art AlphaStar supervised agent. AlphaStar is this model that DeepMind has trained to play the game StarCraft 2, which is a very challenging kind of strategy game, right? And it has been a benchmark for reinforcement learning, where you learn from trial and error to control an agent. So Go, for instance, but you can imagine going from Go to StarCraft is pretty challenging. And this one focuses on this context of offline RL. So that means instead of in typical RL, you're just doing trial and error. So you're basically, executing actions in the environment and see what happens. You learn as you go. Offline reinforcement learning is quite different. It's just you get a bunch of collected data of someone doing stuff in an environment that isn't you, and then you are supposed to learn from that data how to do it. It's more like supervised learning, although it's not exactly that, because you're not given the right action. You're just given the outcomes of these actions taken by someone else. And arguably, offline reinforcement learning is much more scalable because you can collect the data. You don't need to have online continuous interaction with the environment. And then you can do this large data paradigm that we've had. All of that to say, this is pretty significant because now you have this agent that outperforms an agent that trained from supervised data via reinforcement learning.
Yeah, and really that offline thing is a huge deal. You can kind of think about why it would be harder for an agent to learn offline than online. If you think about yourself trying to learn chess just by watching other people play rather than playing yourself. Right? Like if you had a database just of like a ton of chess matches and you watched them all, yeah, you would learn some things for sure. But there's something about being able to choose your own next move, seeing how the world responds to your choice, and then having to make the next move choice again and iterating from there. Like being the person who makes that choice and seeing your environment respond is much more information rich than studying other people's games. That's kind of like one of the central challenges they're looking to overcome with this. And one of the challenges as well is like you have to hope that the games other people have played sort of like cover all the scenarios that you yourself would be interested in playing. And so there's this important notion of what's known as coverage. The more kind of state action pairs are missing from the offline data set, the lower the coverage, the harder the problem is to solve. And so this is quite interesting. One of their big contributions here is just the evaluation strategy that they use. And so, they basically take a bunch of agents, one of which is the very hard player that comes with StarCraft 2, which is actually known to be really good. And so they'll use that. And then they use a bunch of different agents trained in different ways. And essentially the idea is you have a new agent you want to compare? Good. Throw them at our testing suite of a bunch of, I think it's 7 different agents. And we'll create this like matrix of how often you beat each agent. And that's kind of the fingerprint that tells you how good your system is. And then they built their own that got a 90% win rate on the hardest one. And again, using on AlphaStar, using this offline reinforcement learning strategy. So again, not even learning from its own moves, but rather from the moves of others. So kind of really interesting phase transition here. Maybe last thing to say is, the cost of online learning is a lot higher than the cost of offline learning, as you said, Andre. And so you could imagine reaching a point where it actually makes sense to go potentially all offline, just because that once you have a big enough data set and models that can learn offline efficiently enough, you kind of reach that escape velocity where the benefit of that data set size starts to outstrip the benefits of being able to do your online learning. Realistically, I expect these two to be combined in the near future, but still sort of interesting to see that dichotomy play out here.
Exactly. Yeah, offline RL has also been kind of a big deal in robotics. It's been one of the big areas for it, so that showcases, let's say, a more practical application. And they released this data set that showed that you can do offline RL well against just supervised learning. The point, I think, is that you can now use this to compare offline with online RL, RL where you can actually interact with the environment and see how far you can get. Moving on to the lightning round, first we have Raven, in-context learning with retrieval-augmented encoder-decoder language models. So this is a new language model that combines retrieval-based and generative approaches to improve in-context learning. In-context learning is when you want the model to do something it hasn't been explicitly trained to do by just giving it some examples. Retrieval-augmented language models are things where instead of just doing this autocomplete thing that language models do, they have some external database they can query. So that's the retrieval part. And that gets to be there as part of the input. And so this model uses this architecture and has a retrieval mechanism to retrieve relevant information from a knowledge base, and is shown to work really well on this in-context learning task.
Yeah, I'm just looking at one of the figures here that seems kind of interesting. They're showing like the number of in-context examples versus the accuracy score of the outputs, basically. And there's this interesting phenomenon where the bigger models actually like do more poorly at first with a small number of in-context examples, but eventually like they just rocket up and somehow are able to like latch onto something and then outperform all the others. Sort of interesting. It's figure 2. It kind of makes me think of like, when you have a larger model, generally, you're more at risk of overfitting when you have a small amount of data. This is in context learning, though. So sort of it makes me wonder, is something similar happening here? Like we've heard, obviously, there are analogies, deep analogies between in context learning and fine tuning. And so that kind of makes me think like, are we actually seeing a similar phenomenon? Are we really starting to enter a domain here where yeah, where in-context learning really does look more and more like pre-training even. I don't know. It's sort of an interesting question, but and up next we have BOLA, benchmarking and orchestrating LLM-augmented autonomous agents. And so this is just a really interesting overview of a bunch of different types of autonomous agents based on language models. So you might remember, like we've talked about a bunch of these. There's like AutoGPT. Basically, you take your language model and you wrap it up in a framework that makes it behave like an agent. There's Baby AGI. There's a bunch of other kind of Super AGI is another one. Anyway, a bunch of other frameworks like that. And so one of the questions that they're going to try to answer in this paper is what is the best architecture? What's the best way to set up these agents so that they succeed? So that's one question, is how do I bundle? How do I wrap up my agent? What kinds of prompts do I give it? A separate question is, what is the large language model that I should choose as my backbone to make these agents work? So you can imagine you kind of have these two different dimensions, the two different criteria. You could choose any architecture and you could choose any language model. And so they sort of experiment with a bit of a matrix of different combinations of language models and architectures in a way that we haven't really seen before. And just want to flag a couple of the architectures that they look at. Won't go into anything in depth here, but just to give you a sense of the kind of flavor, the strategies people are using and how they differ. So one strategy that they use is called zero-shot LAA. So this is one architecture. So we're not talking about which language model you're using. You could use this for any language model. This is the architecture, the way you bundle your language model to make it agent-like. And so basically the way zero-shot LAA works is you take in the task instruction that you want your system to perform. You'll turn it into basically a zero-shot prompt, basically convert the plain English instruction into like a clear, hey, okay, do this. And then you feed it to a large language model and instruct it to determine the next step. It registers the environment's response and then saves it to memory and then decides whether or not it needs to take another action. So generate another zero-shot prompt. But the thing is, you could imagine taking that basic setup and adding a step where you explicitly ask the language model to plan out its next move using what's known as chain of thought prompting. So you might say, like, let's think about this step by step, is the classic chain of thought prompting example. And so this adds an extra level of deliberation. And this is, instead of being called zero-shot LAA, it's called zero-shot think LAA. And then you could also augment that further by not only having the chain of thought prompt, but also by adding few-shot examples of the sort of task you want it to perform. So show it, for instance, like, before you generate your output, just so we're really clear, here's the kind of output that I might want you to generate based on different scenarios. So you're sort of finding new ways to introduce information to refine your prompts in these systems. And then there are, a couple more agents like that. And so one of the main arguments they're going to make in this paper is, often we think of creating AutoGPT or using one of these agents and just throwing them at a problem. The problem with that, though, is that your agent kind of has to solve the whole problem in one shot. What if, they wonder, you could actually have a central controller that farms out tasks to individual agents that each specialize in a subdomain? So if you're trying to do some kind of like AI system that interacts with the web, maybe instead of having one agent that crawls the web, finds things and clicks on them, you should have one agent that's responsible for searching or understanding the area, the environment, and a separate agent that's responsible for choosing what to click on or what the next action should be. And to have a kind of central controller that chooses what goes to which agent. And that is what they're going to build. So that's the system that they call BOLA, BOLAA. And they compare its performance to a bunch of these other frameworks, and they base their BOLA agent on all these different language models. They try a whole bunch of, like a dozen different ones or more. And anyway, there's some really interesting results there, but maybe I'll pause there. Andre, what did you think of this?
Yeah, it's very cool. This is coming from Salesforce, and agents in general is a big deal, right? We want to have AI that is ultimately able to execute sort of long-running tasks without you babysitting it, probably that's why AutoGPT and Baby LM and all these things are interesting. And that's something that still is definitely not within reach for language models. Like, yes, you can make them agents, but so far from what I've heard and seen, they're just going to not do it. They're going to mess up. And it's interesting reading this paper, seeing that there really hasn't been very much research. There's been some of these projects like AutoGPT, and there's been a couple papers from this year on React and Rewoo, but that's it, right? So it's a pretty important paper in the sense that this is a very young area of research that has a lot of impact potentially.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And to your point about being like kind of untrodden ground, and there's so much like fresh stuff to be discovered here. There is some weird shit going on in the table. I think they have like, it's called Table 1, where they actually look at the performance of their various agents trained on various large language models, or sorry, they use various large language models, where you find like this phenomenon where as you scale the base model, like the language model up, normally that should make things go better, right? So we're used to the idea of scaling leading to better performance. We have cases where, for example, let me see. So Llama 2 13 billion does, let me see. Yeah, does like half as well. Sorry, yeah, half as well as Llama 2. Sorry, no. Yeah, does half as well as Llama 2. I'm sorry. Llama 2 with 70 billion parameters does like half as well as Llama 2 with 13 billion. So it's a big leap in scale, and yet the performance like goes down a lot for some agents. So this is like with PlanAct and React, which is, I think, quite surprising. And you see this again for Vicuña 7 billion to 13 billion. Or sorry, actually, there the weird thing is there's a sudden leap. Like if you look at Vicuña at 7 billion, your performance is like 0.6. At 13 billion, this is for the BOLA model, a BOLA framework. It jumps up to 0.53. So you almost have this like sudden like burst of agent-like behavior on just a doubling of the base parameter count, which I think is kind of fascinating and surprising.
Yeah, so lots of questions to explore here. And one last story we have from Quanta Magazine: risky giant steps can solve optimization problems faster. We won't go deep on this one, but if you haven't read Quanta, it's a very good magazine that explores pretty deep scientific research in a very approachable way. So this is getting into some pretty deep questions as to general optimization strategies, which is what you do with language models, with neural nets. You optimize them given data. And this is going to some new findings that are kind of counterintuitive to what people usually do of optimizing with consistent steps and not these larger steps that this article explains.
Yeah, like one sort of quick way to sketch this out maybe is like, you can think of a language model as a hill climbing problem. Where like, so imagine you have, let's say, a 2-parameter language model. There's X and there's Y. So you get to walk around in XY space. And the performance of the model is the elevation. So if you, look at that. If I walk around the X direction, the performance goes up. Like I'm climbing this hill. Let me move a little bit along the Y. Like, look, it's going up even more. And now, like a language model is basically that, but with like just a disgusting number of parameters. So instead of a 2-dimensional thing, you're, climbing a 80 billion dimensional thing. Don't think too much about it. But the upshot is the key thing people have thought for a long time is if you're going to do this, you should be taking small steps. Step a little bit, notice, the elevation's going up. Okay, so I'll keep going in this direction. Okay, it's still going up, so I'm going to keep going in this direction. And what they're showing in this paper, in this article, is that sometimes taking a giant step instead of a small step actually gives better results. And this may be because it's kind of knocking you way out of a local hill. Sometimes the problem with taking small steps is that you end up like climbing a little hill and you get to the top of the hill and you're like, oh, great, like I'm king of the mountain, but you might be missing Mount Everest that's just a little further away. If you took a bigger step, you might have gotten there. So that's kind of part of the gist of this. Like you said, Andre, a pretty fundamental question in optimization theory. So no use to going into it in too much detail. But anyway, that's the rough gist.
Yeah. In this metaphor, by the way, you're unable to see. You're just randomly walking around
Yes.
outside. But
good point.
Anyway, yes. Moving on to policy and safety, first we have China's new AI regulations begin to take effect. So these guidelines for AI activity and management have taken effect starting on August 15th. These are provisional guidelines. And yeah, they are pretty significant. They require platforms providing AI services to register and undergo a security review. AI generated content will be mandated to have labels, and the service providers will be held accountable for content created through their platforms. There are monetary fines. It's, as far as regulation of AI that is already active, I think this is pretty much the strongest one there is, if not the only significant guidelines that are in action anywhere.
It very much seems that way. That one of the things that they highlight, and obviously we've talked about the copyright debates and whether OpenAI or whoever else can use New York Times content, for instance, to train their model. Well, one of the things that comes out of these requirements is that foundation models need to be the data, for foundation models needs to come from, quotes, legitimate sources and respect intellectual property rights of the creators. And so, kind of interesting that this is a hard position being taken here on that issue, and obviously maybe not terribly precedent setting in the West, but sort of interesting it's being done there. And then the other thing is, over here we have something called, over here in the United States, you guys have something called Section 230, which is essentially the ruling or the law that says that platforms cannot be held responsible for the content that's generated by their users. So if I go to Facebook and I threaten somebody, Facebook cannot be held liable for my posts. There's the platform, the idea nominally is they're not a publisher. This is not their view. And so they're protected by Section 230. Big question that came up, including at the congressional hearings we've seen on AI recently, is whether Section 230 should apply to generative AI. So should OpenAI, for example, be held responsible if ChatGPT says something about someone that under any other circumstance would be considered a threat or libel or worse? And right now, the position of the Chinese here is, well, basically, no, nothing like that. You're gonna, if you're a service provider, you're gonna be held accountable for anything created through your platform. So that's quite an interesting, again, maybe precedent-setting thing. I don't really know how the interaction there goes across the Pacific, but certainly is where the discussion around Section 230 seems to be headed in the States.
Yeah, so again, pretty significant step. And we've seen things like apps being pulled down from the Apple App Store as a result of this. So it very much affects the ecosystem of AI in China. And, as we've seen with a lot of these global software initiatives with the GDPR in the EU, just this being active there may impact the development of AI also in other countries as a byproduct.
Yeah. Yeah. And actually, one last thing I will flag, I think it really useful to notice the whole of government approach being used here, which I do think will be necessary in the States as well. But they're saying these generative AI measures, they come from a joint effort between 6 government agencies. And they're a whole bunch, everything from what's known as the Cyberspace Administration of China, the National Development and Reform Commission, and the Ministry of Science and Tech. There are a bunch of others too. So really a whole of government thing. Why? Because, well, AI is an everything technology. And so you really need the centralized coordination.
And speaking of guidelines, next story is the Associated Press sets AI guidelines for journalists. So Associated Press, AP, is a pretty big deal as far as news goes. And it is setting these guidelines on using generative AI in news governing. Journalists can experiment with ChatGPT, but should not use it to create publishable content. Any output from a generative AI platform should be treated as unvetted source material and subject to AP's existing sourcing standards. AP will not allow AI to alter photos, video, audio, and will only use AI-generated images if they have this subject of a news story, and so on. So, it seems like a pretty reasonable set of guidelines and probably something that other media outlets will follow.
Yeah, it's also there's a whole bunch of stuff below the surface here too. Where so first of all, I mean AP they're saying is the kind of default standard. They have this thing called the AP style book that they point out the majority of news articles use or at least modify this AP style book to write articles like the one you're reading right now. And so this is a very influential move. You know, AP is a leader that a lot of people follow. And then they also point out like that these standards are being set at the same time that AP signed an agreement with ChatGPT, or sorry, with OpenAI, that is, to use its news stories to train generative AI models. And so they're doing both. This is really interesting. Like we got to use the technology for sure, but let's set these guardrails. So it's an interesting compromise here.
Yeah, I agree. And also, we don't have the story, I think, separately, but it is worth noting that another recent story was that the New York Times has prohibited using its content to train AI models, as opposed to AP, which had a direct partnership. So yeah, it's very much, I think, as you discussed at one point, news media is a big chunk of the training data sets of these models, as far as we can tell, based on the open ones like Common Crawl. They make up something like Wikipedia, a very significant chunk of it. So it does matter whether the data can be used for training or not. Last story, AI detection tools falsely accuse international students of cheating for the markup. So there is this software Turnitin that can say whether something seems AI generated or not. And it turns out that it labeled over 90% of a student's paper as AI generated when it was not. And this is for international student. And then the Stanford computer scientists found more generally that AI detectors have a clear bias against non-native English speaker, flagging their writing as AI generated 61% of the time. So clearly another instance or example in which these detectors are just not something you want to use as educators.
Yeah, and it's also, I guess, on the heels, last week or the week before, of OpenAI retiring their generative AI detector thing. For kind of similar reasons. I mean, they had an outrageously high false positive rate. So basically flagging things as AI generated when they weren't, and also vice versa. So, seems like an indication that the detection side is going to lose to the generation side in the long run when it comes to generative AI text writing.
Last section, synthetic media and art. First story is inside the AI porn marketplace where everything and everyone is for sale. So this is quite the article. It is about Civet AI, where users can browse and download AI models that generate pornographic scenarios using real images of real people, scraped without consent. They host a lot of AI models that are specialized for different purposes. There's some very explicit examples in the article. And yeah, I found this quite surprising that there's a whole website where you can just search for whatever specialized model. There's like a model, I think, for to give one of the less bad examples of like a woman laying down on a bed with her feet up or something. Like that's one model that's specifically for that pose. And there's a lot more. So yeah, it is kind of a nightmare in the case that you can use this to, make deepfake porn.
Yeah, and like to kind of brain hack yourself too, right? To reward hack yourself. Like there's a certain almost civilizational question here where, if you can generate arbitrary stimulus on a screen, like rearrange those pixels in whatever way floats your boat, and those things can get more and more extreme and you gradually get decoupled from reality. It's a sort of almost philosophical issue as much as anything. And it does remind me of remember for a long time there was a subreddit, the deepfake subreddit, which was pulled down quite famously as people were actually exchanging kind of tips on how to refine these models, and even posting. I think they even posted model weights. Certainly, there were communities where that was happening, and so this sort of seems like the same thing, but now off Reddit, where it can't necessarily be policed or monitored as.
Yeah, I should clarify to make sure I don't get this wrong. This site isn't specifically for this thing. Civet AI is more generally for different stable diffusion models. It's generally known that you can customize an existing text to image model with relatively little data to generate a certain art style or certain image type, even a certain person. So there's all sorts of different models on here, and I suppose it looks like they just allow also explicit ones as well. And then there's also another platform called Mage that offers AI models for generating personalized content, including explicit images for premium members. So just one of these things that we're gonna have to deal with, right? And another example where if you do open source things, this is one of the byproducts you'll have. Last story also about text to image or generally image modification. AI botched their headshots from the Wall Street Journal. And yeah, this is kind of an overview article, nothing too specific, but it goes into various examples where when making photos for professional use cases like LinkedIn, various AI platforms generally can mess up when dealing with non-white entries, for instance, Black, Latina, and Asian women. And there's many concrete examples in this one. It's already been shown in research. It's kind of a well-known problem, but in this case, now that it's being commercialized and people are trying to use these tools, it's good to sort of highlight that this is a possible issue and it is happening. And if you're a company working on this, you definitely want to be wary and do your best, I suppose.
Yeah, I guess big challenge in terms of like the data sets too, making sure the data sets are balanced. And there's always it's all the usual trade-offs where it's like if you go to max out the amount of data that you have so the model performs better overall, then you're going to have this disparity where the data that's more common. So in this case, you have white skin tones, that sort of thing. It'll be more common, be overrepresented. Your model will probably do better with those. And then like with other folks, you'll get worse outputs. And so the central question is often like, okay, well, do I balance my data set by sacrificing, like maybe even the bulk of my data just to make sure that the outputs are equal across the board? Or how do I trade these things off? Part of that comes down to, loss functions and data augmentation and stuff like that. So very challenging technical problem given the data sets, and obviously the consequences of not addressing it are not insignificant.
Yeah, and just one more thing, I think it maybe is interesting to note. We often use the word alignment when we talk about chatbots. This is another instance of alignment when you want AI to take the image of your face, generate professional LinkedIn photos. A failure case is, let's say, messing up your image by making your skin tone different or adding clothing that doesn't make sense. So this is another kind of example of alignment, is we want the AI to do what we want to do, and we need to figure out how to do that.
Absolutely.
Okay, well, that's it for this episode that is hopefully coming out today or tomorrow. Thank you so much for listening. As always, feel free to email us at contact@lastweekinai with any suggestions or feedback or thoughts. As always, we would appreciate it if you share and review and subscribe and all those fun things. But regardless, please do keep doing it.